Courtney, thank you for putting this together for us, and thanks for all the logistics work up front. As she mentioned, today we're going to be learning about whooping cranes and how civil works projects and military installations may have viable habitat for viable habitat for whooping crane stopovers during their migration south. And we've been privileged to have Dr. Wade Harrell with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He is the whooping crane recovery coordinator and co-leads the international recovery team for whooping cranes. And he works at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. And then we have Dr. Aaron Pierce, who is on the other end of the Flyway, still in the U.S., but he is at the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center working for USGS, and he is stationed in Jamestown, North Dakota. The Corps of Engineers is working on a MOU between the wild whoopers, the Friends of Wild Whoopers, and the Corps of Engineers to assess whooping crane habitat at some of our projects. We have approximately 130 projects in the Corps of Engineers that fall within or close to the flyway that the whoopers use on their way from Canada to the Gulf Coast. So we thought in the stewardship world that it would be a viable thing to take a look at across the entire flyway. And so with that, we do have Mr. Chester McConnell also on the phone, and after Wade and Aaron are done and we go through questions, he will give us a brief description of what the Friends of Wild Whoopers have been doing too. So if you want to stay on for that, you're welcome. And with nothing else, I will turn it over to Dr. Harrell to get started.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, and I just want to thank the Army Corps of Engineers for giving Aaron and I the opportunity to do this presentation. I will say that the Corps has been really a long-time partner of the Fish and Wildlife Service and all our other federal partners, but also state and NGO partners in the conservation of this species for many, many years. I think historically we've probably worked more with the Army Corps of Engineers in the wintering grounds along the coastal areas of Texas on coastal projects, but as you heard in the introduction, more recently it's kind of dawned on us that the Army Corps of Engineers owns and manages quite a bit of potential and currently used stopover habitat in the migration corridor. And so Aaron will be talking more about some of our research around the stopover habitat in the migration corridor, but to get us started, I'm going to give kind of a broad overview of whooping crane conservation, this endangered species, and where we stand right now, and some of our work and what we're seeing in terms of changes in the species more recently. Courtney, do I have control of the presentation where I can click forward now? Oh, there it is.
Yes, sir, you can.
Looks like I've got that now. So I like to start presentations with the most frequently asked question I think I get from not only our partners in federal agencies but members of the public, which is how many whooping cranes are there in the wild and in other places. So we'll start here and talk a little bit about the different populations of whooping cranes. The population that we're going to spend most of our time talking about in this presentation is the wild, what we call the wood buffalo, breeding in Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada, and Aransas, and migrating down and staying in the winter at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas, that wild migratory flock. This is the population that got down to less than 20 birds in the early 1940s, and basically the population that has built back the rest of the species and the genetic material for other reintroduction projects that we've done since then. And so we had a record survey estimate from last winter of a little over 431 birds. You see that there, and the population continues to grow. We hit 300, I believe, about 3 years ago, and so we're increasing at a pretty rapid clip compared to the early days of the conservation of the species back in the 40s and 50s. One of the things that we've done in the conservation of the species over the years is breed whooping cranes in captivity, basically from eggs collected from that wild flock, and then reintroduce chicks into the wild in different places in the U.S. You'll see a few of the Florida non-migratory flock there mentioned with a few birds left. It was an early reintroduction effort we started in the 90s. The eastern migratory flock migrating from Necedah National Wildlife Refuge in Wisconsin down to the southeastern U.S., still an active reintroduction project, a little over 100 birds there. And then the Louisiana migratory flock, our newest reintroduction effort, and it's a non-migratory population, resident population in southwest Louisiana, where we have Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, our primary partner there, about 60 birds. And then basically our breeding stock, if you will, in captive facilities, both in the U.S. and in Canada, numbers about 200 birds. So if you sum all those numbers up, you get a total of about 800 whooping cranes in the wild, which is, in the wild and captivity, I should say, which is quite amazing in that when you think about it, that's probably have more whooping cranes now than we had 150 years ago. We move to the next slide. So the next logical question, once you know how many we have, is how many do we need? Specifically, how many do we need to, remove this bird from the endangered species list, or at least downlist it from an endangered status to a threatened status? So this slide gives those numbers on what we think we need. At least the last time we did a updated international recovery plan with our partners in Canadian Wildlife Service back in 2007. So this is about a 10-year-old plan, but still what we base our management on. As you see, there's three different options basically for that, how that wild Aransas wood buffalo population interacts with reintroduced populations in terms of the numbers we need. Basically, the way it works is the more birds that we have in the Aransas wood buffalo, the wild population, the fewer number of reintroduced populations we need in terms of balancing that resilience of the species overall. And so you can kind of see there where we're at based on my previous slide. You can see we've recently exceeded 400 individuals in that wild Aransas AWBP, as you see it there, population. And then we do have one of our reintroduced populations that's nearing that 120 number. The issue with reintroduced populations has been historically that we're not getting enough wild chick recruitment to offset mortality, so the populations are not self-sustainable at this point, which is a requirement in these objectives. And then objective 2 is maintain that genetically stable captive population that I mentioned earlier as well. And so these are criteria that in the U.S. anyway, under the Endangered Species Act, that the Fish and Wildlife Service would use to make a downlisting decision. In other words, downlisting the species from endangered to threatened. We have not at this point. When we do an updated recovery plan, we will likely also develop some what we call delisting criteria to move it that next step to being completely off the endangered species list. But we have not done that yet. This is just a map of the U.S. of those different populations that I've been talking about and where they lie geographically. You see in the west a population that I didn't mention before, very early, our first reintroduction effort that we have no extant birds in anymore, the Rocky Mountain non-essential experimental population. But as you can see, the reintroduction conservation tool has been tried very much across the U.S. in most of what was the historical range for the species. And then you see that middle area of the central flyway of the Great Plains of the U.S. that we'll spend more time talking about today. So I just want to talk a little bit about, and we're going to go specifically into this wild Aransas wood buffalo population and talk about what we're seeing now in terms of the changes. As I mentioned, this is a population that dwindled to a very small number, less than 20 birds in the early 1940s. It wintered. Its wintering range was very restricted, just on Aransas National Wildlife Refuge back at that time. and then the population grew very slowly. It's a long-lived bird with fairly limited reproduction. Laying 2 eggs, generally only one of those eggs hatching and recruiting a chick on average every other year. So fairly slow growing population, a bird that can live up to 30 years in the wild. And so we've seen this slow trend of growth over time, and now as you see that number, over 400 birds in this population, it's starting to hit a little faster clip, if you will, in terms of growth. And along with that population size increase, we're also seeing an expansion in where it spends its winters along the Texas coast. This used to be a bird strictly associated with Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, but now what we've seen is only about half of the population, any typical winter, spends all of its time on Aransas, and a lot of the population is in other places off refuge, private lands, state lands, those kind of things. This particular picture I have here is in a private land area about 120 miles northeast of Aransas in cropland in a rice agricultural field. So I think one of the paradigm changes we've seen in terms of species conservation with whooping cranes is that they're in contact with humans much more than they were in the early days of the conservation of the species. So given that, we've done a lot of outreach efforts with the public. This is one of the things we've tried to put out in areas where hunters may come into contact with whooping cranes, and they need to be aware to watch out for them. I'll mention this specific poster that we developed with Texas Parks and Wildlife. We used at one of the core installations at Granger Lake in central Texas a few years ago, and we had whooping cranes that spent the entire winter there, some of that expansion that I was talking about earlier that we're seeing. This is a slide of just the coastal area, the salt marsh habitat that the whooping cranes use in Texas in the winter. And you can see the refuge is just about 2 miles to the east or to the right-hand side of the picture that you see, but you can see some of that marsh edge around the bay on the left-hand side or west side of the picture. That picture is facing north. And what you see is this human encroachment, human subdivisions. This is a canal lot subdivision, a fairly old one, but you see a lot of human infrastructure that whooping cranes now have to contend with that they really never did in the early days of the conservation story of the species when they were just on Aransas. This is a photo of the land that you see is Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, and really the heart of where whooping cranes have wintered for a long, long time and where they made their winter comeback from. That was purchased by the federal government in 1937, that original unit of Aransas. And what you see here are those barges are actually on the Corps-maintained intercoastal waterway. That probably one of the biggest changes that we saw in those wintering habitats of whooping cranes historically was the dredging of the intercoastal along the marshes in the mid-coast of Texas around the 1940s. We worked with the Corps for many years on the management of the intercoastal waterway to minimize the impacts to whooping cranes. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, we did with the Corps on a Section 7 a major erosion control project along the refuge. And more recently, we've done a number of beneficial spoil disposal areas that are used by whooping cranes on the Texas coast around the refuge with the Corps. Just a close-in picture, you can see that erosion matting I mentioned before. That's right along the intercoastal waterway and a pair of cranes in very typical Texas salt marsh in the wintertime. And I think that's all I've got, and I'm going to pass it off to Aaron, and I'll let him talk more about some of our research efforts with telemetry.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Wade, for the kind of introduction there, and everyone else for having us. It's a great opportunity to be able to talk with you today. So again, my name is Aaron Pierce. I'm with USGS, and I'm going to take us through kind of the end of the presentation here. And so, as Wade kind of mentioned before, this is about a more specific research effort that occurred on whooping cranes over the past number of years. And so I always want to kind of start with the organizations and the people, more importantly, or as importantly as the organizations that were involved. You're going to hear Wade and myself talk, but really it took a lot of people to make a lot of this happen. And so I kind of wanted to make sure that we kind of at least start off kind of with that. And I hit the wrong button. Okay, so we let's just do a little background on what we're doing here, what we did. This is essentially a kind of capturing and marking of individuals with transmitters. That's kind of the core of what the project is. And so we caught birds on the left-hand picture at Wood Buffalo National Park. That's up in the boreal forest. It's pretty much vast wilderness. Helicopters and actually hand-catching young before they're able to fly, and putting transmitters on them. So it's a method that had been done before, but it's what we used kind of again. On the right side is actually at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. So we caught the other half of our sample, or the adults that we were going to capture on the wintering grounds. Now this is something that no one had ever done before, so we had to come up with some methods. This, as you can see, I'm kind of setting the trap. It's a leg noose essentially. It looks a little bit silly with the corn in the middle there, but you know, they come to the bait and then get captured by the leg in a leg noose. Worked really well for us, and we're able to get our sample because of the methods there. It's a leg-mounted transmitter. Maybe some of the folks that are in the Flyway have seen birds with these on already. And it's solar powered, so it's going to last for a number of years. It collects GPS points every 4 to 5 of those a day, and then it transmits the information to a satellite system. So that's the basics for the kind of the core of the data that we're collecting here. And so again, and also realize, as you see from the picture there, it's got some field readable components to it. You know, these are individually marked birds. We can kind of, if we get, you know, observations even after the transmitters have failed, and you know, we can get more information, you know, even after the kind of beyond the life of the project. When we started the project, and you know, I kind of worked backwards here, I guess, a little bit. You know, the start of the project, I think, you know, would put some things into context. You know, there was always some interest in getting some more baseline information on cranes, and I don't think that we could ever say that that isn't a main component of this project. It's just some more baseline information on the birds than what we'd received before. But there were some other things that were kind of going on, and really are still going on throughout their life. The top picture there is oil or tar sands mining in Alberta. The migratory corridor of the cranes goes through that area, so our Canadian Wildlife Service partners have been and are still very interested in those interactions. Power lines have always been kind of a bugaboo for cranes and something that people have worried about, rightly so. And wind towers are kind of that have been seemingly emerging for quite a while. Obviously, they're now standards on the landscape, but still, how does that potentially affect whooping cranes? And at the time, there was actually some problems or some issues going on the wintering grounds with freshwater inflows into the bay that kind of feeds that ecosystem that the cranes use. And so that was another kind of an underpinning. So really, the whole idea was to get some of the sense for what was going on year-round for the cranes, and that's why we kind of went with these kind of methods and this technology. Okay, so we're going to kind of transition into what actually we were learning here. I guess, again, to set the stage, I didn't even really include this, but about 2010 is when we started, roughly the end of 2009, and we started putting transmitters on, till the end of 2016, and we really marked the birds actually a little bit before that. We stopped, I think, in 2014. But in total, we had 68 birds that we marked, and we've been collecting data for this time period. Right now, I think there's only 2 of these transmitters that are still transmitting data. So in essence, we really have all the data that we're likely going to get from this project already. On the right is kind of another way to kick us off here. So what I did was I just pulled out locations from all the years of our study between, kind of right around right now, the end of November to December. So what we find is that, as you'd imagine, migration in almost all the years is pretty much complete. There's a few birds that are maybe still sprinkled through the migration corridor. In our sample, Kansas and south, but for the most part, about 95% of the birds are already on the wintering grounds, and most of them have been there for a little while. So let's kind of get some. We're gonna start kind of big picture, and then we're gonna slowly move to kind of more on the ground and smaller scale stuff. So let's start with some very big picture stuff. And again, this is all information that has been derived from our telemetry data so far. So the migration, and on the right there is it's a stylized, I think I actually made that up, but it's a stylized kind of idea of how the birds move through the migration corridor. The points would be places where they stop at night for 1 to multiple days, and then they actually migrate during the day. So the kind of the line would be that migration route or whatever from kind of stop to stop that they make. And so they kind of move down, or wouldn't matter, move down or move up the corridor depending upon the season. In total, it's about a 2,400-mile journey. That's including ones that go from wood buffalo to the Gulf Coast. We've actually had birds that, as Wade mentioned, start at like Granger Lake in kind of middle of Texas. Some of them don't make it all the way up. They stay in Saskatchewan for the winter. But to make this kind of full classic migration takes about 2,400 miles. And they've completed in anywhere from 14 to 86 days. At least that's again from our telemetred birds. So they can cook down this pretty fast if they want to. And of course, some of them are kind of slow pokes. In the fall, it takes a little bit longer than the spring. So about 7 weeks in the fall and 4 weeks in the spring. And a lot of that extra time they spend in the fall, and a lot of folks probably are aware of this, is spent in Saskatchewan, kind of that southern tier of Saskatchewan, kind of, if you know your geography, Saskatoon area and a little bit south. They can hang up there for a couple weeks, and usually they'll have their chicks with them at that time. They're kind of new flyers, and so they spend some time probably gaining some energy before making the final migration. A little bit less. They don't do that in the spring. They don't spend that very long period, those weeks at one place, and so the migration is shorter in spring. Average number of night stops is 11 to 12. I think 11 might be the average for fall and 12 for spring, but it doesn't really matter, right? It's kind of 10 to 12 stops that they make on average to get from place to place. And so, of course, that leads us to the next metric is, how long between stops? I mean, I see a lot of things about, you have to have migration stops every so often. Well, the average distance, the average flight that they make in a day, so from one migration stop over to the next, is 300 kilometers. That is that is the same in the spring and the fall. We've seen anything up to, I think, maybe over 1,000 kilometers in a day. That's an extreme. And then we see things like, sometimes 20, 30 kilometers. They'll just go a little distance to another spot, stop. Not knowing, we don't exactly know the reason why they would do that, but they're not that serious about migration that day, I guess. Maybe the conditions aren't that conducive to it or whatever. But that 300 is at least an average. Finally, on this slide, this is something we cooked up a couple of years ago. I haven't updated it, but I think it's probably going to still hold. About 15% of the stops, this would be in the U.S. only, are on public lands. If anyone, I'm sure a lot of you folks are probably aware of the percentage of lands in the central Great Plains states that are in public lands, and it is much less than this. So, I would say it depends on the state, but about 5 to maybe 15%. So they use public lands probably more than it's available to them. But as I usually like to say when I'm kind of giving to a broader audience, that still leaves 85% that's on private lands. And so private lands are definitely still a very huge component to whooping cranes and really key to the whooping cranes in their migratory corridor. And then conversely, what I would say to this audience is that public lands are still, kind of a big deal as well. Okay, So let's do a little bit of timing. So what I've got there is I've got on the left is fall, on the right is spring. We see I've just got some average departure and arrival dates. So this would be the full migration. So thinking about when they're actually leaving their wintering grounds or leaving their summering grounds to their place. And you can see the graphics here. It gives you an idea of, you know, when fall migration occurs, when its peak is, and then on the right, when spring migration occurs and when its peak is. The things that I would note here is that if you look at kind of how wide those two distributions are, it's about a 3-month time period that you have any birds in migration. So fall, you got a kind of roughly September, October, November. In spring, roughly March, April, May. And again, that's for the full migration. And what that means, because, you know, any one bird is only migrating from, let's say 7 to 10, so 4 to 7 weeks. These birds don't migrate all at the same time. So they have a fairly slow migration or prolonged migration. And you can even get times when you've got birds in any one of the 3 kind of states at any one time. So it's a little bit more pronounced in the spring, where you'll have, you know, certain dates, kind of that early May period. We've had birds that are still on the summering grounds. They haven't left yet. They've already arrived. They're still on the wintering grounds. They haven't left yet, and they're actually in migration all at the same time. So they definitely, the whole population kind of takes a while to get up and down the migration corridor. Okay, so that's a little bit about the when. How about the where? Jeremy talked about the migration corridor a little bit. We've this is a product that we are almost ready to release, or I hopefully within the next couple months release. The Fish and Wildlife Service in the past has created kind of migration corridors based on opportunistic sightings that they've collected, you know, since the 40s. The Canadian Wildlife Service has collected a comparable data set as well. And what we do is we combined those two data sets with the telemetry data to come up with kind of at least a contemporary migration corridor. And this is kind of what we come up with. This at least is a preliminary one that we've come up with. It gives you an idea of, it's got 3 different kind of grades or scales. It's the hottest red or darkest red there is where about 50% of all of the locations are within that area. The second one is 75%, and that lightest shade of red is 95%. So it doesn't include all the areas where cranes have ever been seen or detected, but it gives a pretty good indication of where cranes are. And so this is a type of map a person could use from, let's say, a land management standpoint. Is my area within this? If it's not within it, it isn't that there's never a chance that a whooping crane will use that area. It's just it's certainly a much less of a chance than if it was in, let's say, the center of the corridor. So this is something that we'll soon be able to share, and this will be actually freely available to everyone, so that depending on whatever you're trying to manage or consider, this will be out there for you. This is a similar product, and I only bring it up because it's actually available right now. This is something we did a couple of years ago just using the telemetry data. It's a slightly different approach where we basically we binned the area into a square grid, kind of gridded it out, and then looked for how many stopover points, how many times when the birds were actually on the ground, how often did that happen. And so you can come up with areas that are of higher intensity use, the red areas, ones that are of a little bit, used lesser, smaller amounts of time and as often, that's the gray, and then of course places where we didn't see cranes at all. So this would be something that you could look up right now if you wanted something kind of in the interim. Okay, now let's combine space and time for a minute, because it's one thing to talk about the total migration, but really I think what people are probably interested in, especially again as a land manager in one specific place, is when are the cranes coming through my area? And this is one way to express that, or that I've expressed it. So you see kind of on the left there, you've got the timing, and on the right you've got a map. So I just basically sliced up the corridor into 6 different slices, and so those are kind of spatial windows that we can look at. So you'll see things like in the fall, in those windows kind of 6 and 5, there's a long time period in which cranes are within that window, or are within that area. Of course, this has to do with them being there for a long period of time as well. And then as you move down the corridor, the windows get kind of progressively shorter. The time windows get shorter. In the spring, the windows are about the same size. You know, they're kind of in these different, they're progressing up the corridor in a fairly logical manner. So let's say, for instance, window 3, which is kind of the southern, Nebraska, and it includes a little bit of South Dakota and Kansas. You might say, oh, well, looks like about April. Obviously give or take a little bit, but April is kind of the prime month for when we would expect cranes to be in our area. We can slice these into smaller slices if one wants. I've done that for a few of the kind of very important areas, but I still think something kind of large like this makes a little bit more sense. I mean, you're never going to pinpoint it to, today is an important day, but tomorrow isn't. I mean, there's always going to be a gradient, and there's always going to be some migration seasons that are a little bit different, in early spring and what have you. But this gives us some idea of kind of when and where the cranes are during migration. Okay, so let's start drilling down a little bit more into kind of on the ground. I talked about stopover sites for a moment, and this is a map of where we've seen places where cranes have actually spent the night, 1 to multiple nights. A single night visit, when they're there for when they get there in the evening, spend the night, and leave the next day, is the most common stopover length of time. It's just 1 night. That's the smallest dots there. The larger dots is when they spend multiple nights there. So as you can see in the fall, you get a lot of clustered in Saskatchewan, but really you can have those multiple night visits kind of anywhere throughout the corridor. In the spring, although there's a few mixed throughout the entire corridor, it looks like kind of northern Kansas to Saskatchewan is kind of a cluster of where we see these multiple night visits. And so this is, of course, the idea about these, when they're there for multiple days, this is when they can start doing more. I mean, usually when you see these 1-night visits, they're really just going to a wetland, they're spending the night, and they're leaving. But when they're there for 5-6 days, they explore around the area. And that usually becomes kind of the next question as well. Okay, we have cranes, let's say, roosting at a wetland, a specific wetland. Here you see this map. It's a little bit hard to see. I should have made these points a bit bigger. But in the center of this map is a wetland that's got a place where this crane roosted for a couple of days. I don't even remember how long this crane was here. But every now and then, and again, remember, I only collect about 4 or 5 locations a day. So we don't get a ton of daytime locations, but we can see, about a mile northwest, it was up there, and then it spent some time in a field just south of its roosting site. And so the idea is like, well, how big of an area do we need to be thinking about when we see cranes at a specific location? So what I did was just initially, it was to just say, okay, well, what's the center of these locations? And then how far is each one of them from the center? And what we find is about a half mile is about where the median is. So half the time, they're less than a half mile from kind of the central area where they spend their time. And then the other half the time, they're greater than a half mile. And then if you think about this kind of out to, I did a 95th percentile, so just trying to incorporate most of the data, we get to about 3.5 miles. I think the upshot here is that if you see cranes in your area, at your place, wherever, they're spending, if they're spending a fair bit of time there, they're not going terribly far from you. I mean, I guess I don't think 3.5 miles as far as a 2,400 mile migration corridor is very far. They're home bodies when they find an area to spend for a couple of days. Okay, now we're going to go to some pictures here. And so let's just get a kind of a feel for where the places that cranes like. This is a wetland in South Dakota taken by kind of a local photographer there. He let me use a few of his pictures. And so this is a semi-permanent wetland. You can see that it's obviously drawn down a bit, so they're kind of at a mudflat area between some cattails and then the water as it would be in the foreground here. Wetlands by far and away are the most common places where cranes would spend the night. But they also spend time in the uplands too. These birds, it will be in crop fields, in pastures. They definitely are a bird probably of kind of shorter vegetation. You got to think maybe more historically about these birds migrated through the Great Plains when the bison roamed the area. You know, this wasn't just, you know, grass that wasn't grazed to some extent. So I mean, they're birds of probably short to mid grass, I think. Ephemeral wetlands. So the reason why there's people in some of these pictures, we did send technicians out to specific sites to collect data. And one thing we had to do was take pictures like this where this is where the crane would have been during the night while they were visiting the area. And so you get fairly ephemeral wetlands. You get more permanent type of wetland. This would be a stock pond or something. This is in North Dakota, but we really saw stock pond use kind of throughout the migration corridor. And impoundment areas. This is kind of I don't actually know much about this one except for it's quite shallow. The person's out there quite a ways, and it's actually surrounded by, I think, 2 or 3 sides by a golf course. So it's kind of a weird one to include there. So I think maybe the next question one would have, I mean, I've shown you a few pictures, but you know, what do we define as stopover habitat for cranes? Like what should we be thinking about? And here I have to really just talk or kind of go to the folks who spent the most time thinking about it. And that's folks along the Platte River in south central Nebraska. It's a critical habitat area that's been designated as critical habitat for whooping cranes. And for a number of reasons that aren't worth maybe going into right now, it's been kind of almost studied to death and worked to death. And so if anyone spent time thinking about that, it's these folks. And they're the ones who actually funded us to go to other sites around to kind of get a sense for crane habitat. But if I had to boil down what they've amassed through time, it would be these 4 points. And I'm actually even gonna kind of point 3 and 4 are really almost kind of the same. And so it has to do with disturbances nearby. Disturbances, I'm mainly thinking about things that are kind of human-related, like roads, buildings, machinery, things like that. Unobstructed views, having a large view area so that they can look to make sure that predators aren't sneaking up on them. And water depths that are somewhat adequate. We'll do slides on each of these, but you know, these birds are, yes, they can float, but they don't really like to float. So they're standing and they're wading in water, and so there is that. And then, of course, having a fair amount of that suitable water depth around them. So a picture like that you see in the background here of some nice shallow areas and sandbars, you know, this is definitely good. Having, you know, 2 square meters of suitable depth surrounded by a bunch of deep water isn't really going to be that useful to them. So disturbance distances. I do include some figures here, and this is actually from a report that you guys can get out of it if you'd like. I'm not really, I don't know that we need to focus a lot on specific numbers for a moment. I will throw a few out there. What you'll see on the bottom is you'll see a histogram of kind of the distance to the nearest disturbance feature that we found. If you look all the way on the right, you see that really huge bar. That's when they actually couldn't determine one. You know, it was like so far out there they never even recorded one. I think I wanted to make sure that was known, but you really can't, you know, calculate an average from a number like that. And then that other little figure there that's got the kind of the boxiness, the middle line there is kind of the median essentially. And it's the median, the 25th percentile, and the 75th percentile. So here you see that little over 500 meters is the median for how close disturbance features were to cranes when they were roosting. And so you can kind of get an idea that they don't like to be terribly close to disturbance features. Maybe, you know, into that 250 meter range or so is probably still okay for them. Click the next. And then we got open areas. You know, they like, and again, you probably could tell from the pictures, they like areas that are open and not specifically crowded with, say, trees, shrubs, tall herbaceous vegetation, even sometimes just topographic features like kind of cliffs or banks. You know, we thought about it as areas that would be, you know, impede their vision. Here we've got a median about 200 meters as the closest feature. So think about kind of a radius around the bird. You know, how close do they like to be to these different features? But obviously, the wider open area, probably the better for them. And then finally, water depth. As you can see just from this picture here, you know, this is probably, I don't know if there's such thing as an ideal depth, but I'm sure that they're, you know, quite happy in a depth like this. We saw that the median kind of water depth was around 12 centimeters there, but really all the way, I guess the 90th percentile, that's actually that dot on the figure there, is at about 30 centimeters. So obviously the shallower the better, and even bare mud flat areas isn't a bad thing. But they like, again, this idea of being safe and secure. You know, I'm out here as a coyote, you know, it's not that awful easier for you to trudge through water and I can hear you and I can see you. And so that makes them feel secure. Or that's at least the hypothesis anyway. All right, so we wanted to focus a little bit on reservoirs, and that's what I'm going to kind of wrap us up with here a bit. This is Harlan County Reservoir in Nebraska. This is the Corps of Engineers managed property. And what I wanted to kind of start with here is the idea that, you know, I'm going to show you a couple of these, and of course I've got the points where the cranes actually were at. But realizing that this picture, I don't even know when this picture was taken. That fall 2014 is actually incorrect. I meant to take that off the slide. I don't know when this aerial photo or image was actually taken. So realize that, you know, the suitable depth, who knows where it was really at? You know, I've just made this up. You know, maybe this was the deep water, and you know, obviously shorelines are important, and probably inflow areas that probably get silted in are probably important. But you know, I don't really know when we look at these where the deep water versus shallower water line was. And so that's important to kind of consider is, you know, how much available habitat there is in, especially these reservoir situations. This is totally dependent upon water levels. So here's one in Kerwin. This, I believe, is a Bureau of Rec property. It's actually also got a wildlife refuge associated with it, although I don't know exactly the boundaries. But again, you can see shorelines, inflow areas, and maybe an island there, kind of in that south part. And now it's some actual pictures. So again, this is where we actually went out and collected some measurements. You can see, you know, quite a bit of a mud flat area and a shallow area. Here it looks like the shallow extends quite out a ways, and the person's out there a fair distance from shore. Another one very similar to that as well. And then here's some actual birds from fall of 2013, probably kind of in that inflow area. And again, you can see that probably a few of them, their heads are down. I think they're actually foraging out there. So, you know, this is definitely not bad crane habitat, at least as far as a lot of the criteria that we already talked about. We'll do one more. This is Wilson Lake in Kansas. This is an Army Corps property. Again, you can see shorelines. You can see kind of the upper reaches of the reservoir. I included a few of the upland sites as well. So they definitely use the area around there, but definitely use the lake itself. So some shoreline areas. You can see, obviously, the water is receded a ways from that vegetation. Mud flats. I don't even know if they made it out all that far. Looks like they probably hate me for making them trudge out through mud and muck. And then finally, another shoreline. The notes on this data card actually suggest that they talked to a private landowner. They must have accessed, you know, went through private land to get to the site. And the landowner specifically said that this is the lowest that they'd seen the lake in, you know, I don't know, decades or whatever, however long that they'd been owning the land and kind of watching the reservoir and probably using it. And I guess that kind of gets to my final point about this. I didn't say this before, but we've not really done any formal analysis on reservoir use per se at this point. It's not that it hasn't been important or couldn't be important to us, but we've had a lot of other things that we've wanted to get done in time. So what I've kind of presented to you is just some very general statements about reservoir use, and nothing that's really been formally done yet. And so I guess what I'd wrap up with is my hypothesis about reservoir use, kind of what I think I'm seeing, without any really data behind it yet. And that is that if you think about these reservoirs when they're drawn down, it's usually, we had some pretty droughty periods during the study, and that's likely when we saw most of our reservoir use. And as you can see from the pictures, it probably was pretty good stuff for them, right? There was a lot of shallow areas, a lot of mud flats, that kind of stuff. You think about the flip side of that, a time when we've got a lot of water on the landscape, at least regionally. So this is the time when the reservoirs are probably full, conservation pool or above, because you're retaining water for flood purposes, especially in the spring. But that's probably the exact time when the rest of the landscape is probably pretty good for cranes. The wetlands or playa lakes, wherever, depending on where you're at, the rivers are probably flowing pretty good. Stock ponds are probably full. Those are probably times when the reservoirs maybe aren't really as necessary. And so I think there might be, and we could probably look at this, but there's probably this kind of compensation or whatever you want to call it that's going on, is that when the rest of the landscape isn't that great for cranes, they've got this refugia on these reservoirs and other areas like that, and then at other times it maybe is less important. Now again, don't quote me on that. It's just kind of a hypothesis from what I've been seeing, but I think it would likely bear out if we kind of put pen to paper and looked at the data. So I want to wrap up with 4 key points, kind of like this is the old if you didn't get anything else, maybe take this home. From Wade's talk, I would say cranes are recovering, and I think he made the point, the Aransas wood buffalo population is the key. The recovery efforts the reintroduction efforts haven't been completely successful yet. So this population is the key to the recovery at this point. Cranes need places to stop during migration. I guess that's not an amazing statement to make, but it's important. And I think there's a wide range of places that likely suffice for this, whether it be wetlands, rivers, reservoirs, and even within you get any one of those categories, I think there's a lot of different places that meet their needs. But if we had to define it, we would say open areas with few disturbances and shallow water is what probably defines, in shorthand, defines potential crane habitat. And then finally, just to kind of make that last point again that I was just making before, that large bodies of water are used by cranes. We've documented that. And it's probably more important in dry years. Okay, so this is where I end. I do thank you very much for your attention. Again, I want to make sure to highlight our partners. It isn't just Wade and myself. And I'll also mention that we've got our email addresses down below there. If you think of a question later on or whatever, I never think of them until the next day, to be honest with you. Please jot down our information. Send us an email if you got an idea about this or that. We're happy to take those. It helps us out. And as Wade said in the beginning about the Fish and Wildlife Service working closely with the Corps, at USGS we also work closely with the Corps, or we have at certain projects. I mean, we're an agency that works in our department as a research agency, but we also work with other federal agencies. We work with the Corps a lot on Missouri River projects here and piping plovers. We worked with as kind of a main, a key one that I'm aware of, but I'm sure we've done other things. We do other things as well. We work with state organizations, or state agencies and organizations as well. So we do a lot of things, and so if you've got ideas about the data that we've got, or even about some other potential data collections, I'd certainly love to hear about it. We'll do our best to come up with some project ideas. So I think that I'm going to stop there. Courtney, if you want to kind of get things going, or whatever we're doing next.
Okay. No, that's great. Yeah,
Hey, Courtney.
thank you very much, Wade. Yes.
Oh, no, go ahead and say thanks, and then I'll interrupt you.
Oh.
Sorry.
Well, that was all. Thank
Okay.
you, Wade and Aaron. Go ahead, Jeremy.
So, hey, everybody, this is Jeremy Crossman again, and I would like to also say thank you very much, guys, for providing this to us. And then two other things. Aaron, your point, cranes need places to stop during migration. I think that's the only reason all of us are on the phone today, so you made it sound like it wasn't really ingenious, but it got all of us together to talk about whooping cranes. And then I would also like to acknowledge Rich Fisher, because we were trying to work on this as only a Civil Works thing, and he had the idea to put the military folks and the Civil Works folks on the same phone line to do this. And so far it seems to be a success, so it may not be the last time you see us do a joint presentation on some sort of migration or wildlife habitat type of subject. And with that, Courtney, I would say if you want to open it up to everyone for questions, that's all I've got.
I will. And one quick note, I want to ask you one more time to make sure your phone line is muted before we return to interactive mode. And you are free to ask your question over the phone line, or you can continue to utilize the chat feature, and I've had a few come through there. So here we go, open it up.
To place, all participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Okay, so at this time, feel free to ask away. I might kick us off with one that I received as a private message. I just reposted it in the chat box. But what is the anticipated impact of USGS on raising whoopers at the Patuxent, I guess, reservoir, and what impact has that had on the recovery of the crane?
That would be not raising them.
Oh, sorry, Lou, thanks.
Yeah, I forgot the T.
Yep. Sure, this is Wade. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
We do.
Okay, I'll tackle that question. So it sounds like many of you may know, the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Laurel, Maryland, which is a USGS facility, has been raising cranes in captivity. In fact, it was the first captive facility for whooping cranes established in 1967. So their 50th anniversary, unfortunately, that program was zeroed out in the president's budget, and so USGS came to us and said, let's find a way to transition out of the crane breeding program. And so we have gone through a process with what we call our species survival plan team, which is a Association of Zoos and Aquariums accredited team that manages all our captive whooping cranes. And we put out a request for proposals and searched out private facilities that were willing to take on the captive breeding program issues that Patuxent, the birds themselves, and also the breeding activity from Patuxent. And so we're in the process of transitioning those birds from Patuxent to other private facilities. So probably a little bit of an answer in terms of recovery, probably a short-term impact in terms of breeding production from the captive facilities as we transfer those birds out. But long-term, we don't expect any negative impacts to the captive side of things.
Do y'all ever... Go ahead.
Just Lou, with a follow-up. Do you expect that that the zoos will be able to gear up quick enough to take the birds before the funding ends at Patuxent?
Yes, we're working on that, and my understanding is that USGS is being able to provide some interim funding to allow that transition to happen. That time transition.
Very good. Do they reintroduce the birds ever to the wild population?
To the Aransas wood buffalo population, no, we haven't done any reintroductions of captive reared birds into Aransas wood buffalo.
All right, I received another one from the chat that I'm reposting again from Lou, but how would these lessons learned apply to the eastern migratory population of whooping crane?
Aaron, you want to tackle that one? I assume it's related to migration habitat?
Yeah, no, sure. No, I was just about to jump in. I think that they could be directly related. they're reintroduced birds, but beyond that, well, there's maybe a few other things that are different, but let's say, just talking broadly, they still need the same things, right? They need safe places to stop at night. They need, food and shelter and all that good stuff. So I would say the lessons are almost, pretty much completely applicable to as far as kind of the broad presentation of needing places to stop and the kind of the general characteristics of those places. Where they're at, of course, I think probably the person was aware, we're talking about, the eastern part of the United States and certain places like that. But other than that, it's the same.
All right, thank you. Anyone else have a question? Feel free to speak up.
Courtney, it looks like I see another one here about, are there DoD installations that either create serious issues for whoopers or that provide key stopover locations? I guess I can start on that one. I would say that if you kind of look back at that migration corridor that we've created, and I know that's maybe hard to see at this exact moment, and we'll provide an actual shape file in a couple months. But honestly, if you're in the roughly the center part of any of the Great Plains states in your installation, then yes. Well, I'll say that if you're there and you have any kind of a water body at all, then I would say that it's likely that there could be a place for whooping cranes to be. That's a pretty simple way to put it, but I think that's pretty true. I didn't really get into this, but we've seen cranes at some pretty odd places at times. I think they've been, within a couple miles of, a municipal airport or something. Again, for a night. I don't think it was a big, collision issue, but they can spend places in some pretty odd places at times. So I think if you've got a water body and you're kind of generally within the migration corridor, it's a place. And as far as serious issues for cranes, we're actually, finding that kind of other than predation. So if you just think about kind of some other things that cranes can kill cranes, I guess maybe that's what we're kind of thinking of here. Well, I guess I should step back. Disturbance, obviously anytime any of us does some things, we could potentially disturb cranes. To the level that actually is detrimental to them, I guess is that's not really my purview right now. But as far as like potentially killing them, they do run into things every now and then. So towers and power lines, it can be an issue. But I don't know that those things are all over the place as well, right? It's not just DoD facilities that those type of things are at. So I don't know that there would be anything special.
And I'll just quick follow up on that question in terms of DoD installations. I think I noticed someone from Fort Hood in Texas is on. We did have a documented stopover of some cranes this fall at Fort Hood, and as Aaron mentioned, if you look at the map, Fort Hood falls pretty much right in the migration corridor. Of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service has worked with Fort Hood on other endangered species that occur there, namely golden cheek warblers and black-capped vireos, for many years. So, if that is something that we need to explore more from a partnership perspective, is that something that in natural resource management plans that DoD would like to consider, we're certainly happy to have a discussion about that.
Hey, Courtney, this is Rich Fisher.
Yes,
I'll
go ahead, Rich.
follow up on that question. So I think the biggest issue for DoD right now with whooping cranes is an incident that occurred on the Platte River a few years ago with the Nebraska Army National Guard. Excuse me. And the National Guard is currently consulting with the Fish and Wildlife Service over that incident and looking at potential impacts of overflights. There is some research about to commence looking at impacts of overflights on cranes on the river. So we don't have any outcomes of either the consultation or the research, but that's something that other installations that are within the migratory corridor of whooping cranes need to keep an eye on.
Hey, this is Christine from Redstone Arsenal. We are directly adjacent to Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge in northern Alabama, and we have a pair of that eastern migratory population that like to hang out on our major test area. Does rocket and missile testing. And we've had some consultation with Fish and Wildlife, on a non-protected status, but we have a protocol in place that the test area will recognize their presence and take measures to either avoid testing or to persuade them to leave.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, so thanks for letting me know.
Who was that, Rich? Okay. Was that Rich? Or I'm sorry, who said they weren't aware?
That was Wade.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm willing to talk with you all if you want to.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious. And are you working with the Alabama field office, I guess, on that?
Yep.
Office?
Yep.
Yeah, this is Lou with a question. I guess one of the earlier slides talked about the criteria for delisting. And since some of the reintroductions haven't worked, and I think that was one of the criteria you had there, I'm trying to remember them, but I don't. Do you see a change to the delisting criteria based on that?
Yeah, so one clarification. So what I shown was downlisting criteria rather than delisting.
Oh, okay.
It is a question we have. I mean, if we can't get a reintroduction project to be self-sustainable, i.e., there's more basically bursts in recruiting of young birds into the population than deaths, then we know we have to go back to the drawing board from a recovery perspective and say, okay, how large of a wild Aransas wood buffalo population do we really need so the species is resilient enough and it doesn't face extinction risk? Right. You saw one downlisting criteria related to that of if you just had the Aransas wood buffalo population of needing 1,000 birds in that population, and we have done some habitat planning around that number, particularly in regards to wintering habitat, about how much coastal marsh in Texas would it take to support that number of birds, and what are the impacts of things like sea level rise in human
right.
development impacts of that habitat. So it is certainly we're thinking about from a recovery perspective.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, this is Rich Fisher again.
Go ahead, Rich. Yeah.
I just wanted to acknowledge Chester McConnell and Friends of the Wild Whoopers. I know many people on the line have worked with Chester and Friends of the Wild Whoopers. So Chester contacted me and a few others on the military side to gain access to military installations to look at opportunities to identify and perhaps provide management recommendations for shallow water and wetland areas on military lands. And Chester and his crew visited multiple installations and developed some really outstanding trip reports and management recommendations for installations. And I thought it would be a great idea to do the same thing on Corps of Engineers land. So I asked Jeremy Crossland in headquarters if he would assist with that. And Jeremy and some others in the Corps took that on and have done a really outstanding job of getting Chester in touch with our field folks and allowing Chester to get out to Corps projects. And Chester's in the process right now of developing travel and trips out to Corps projects and then also reports for those visits to our project sites. So Chester, I don't know if you're on the line and want to say anything, but we do appreciate all your efforts in working with us to get that done.
Yes, I am on the line. It's always hard to follow Aaron. He tells you everything. That's a compliment, by the way. No, we've completed our assessment of military bases a couple of years ago and found that they had lots of good habitat, and actually they have hooping cranes that use the areas, but most of the time personnel who work on the lakes and the military bases, they arrive at work about right after the hooping cranes have normally left in the morning to migrate, and the same thing is in the afternoon. So the personnel who are managing the facilities just aren't there, and they have a lot of office duties. So there's a lot more happening on military bases, and core lands than we just normally thought. And we also did the Indian reservations. We visited 8 Indian reservations with several million acres of land, and found out they just had a tremendous amount of good stopover habitat. And now, as Rich just said, we're very proud to be working with the Corps of Engineers and looking at some of their lakes. And what we do, we're not in the research business like Aaron and the Fish and Wildlife Service. We're on the management side. And what we do is use all of the good research data that has been collected over the years about what features that whooping cranes like and where they're going to stop over. And we go out and look at the, right now for the core lakes, we go on a field trip with the personnel from the Corps and look out to see what's there, what good habitat is there and needs to be protected, and then what potential habitat is there and what would be required to make it good habitat. And so we have a good open discussion in the field that gets the personnel that are there now to really understand what they need to do to increase the use of their lands for whooping cranes. So we are early in the study evaluation process now of the Corps. We've done 8 core lakes so far, and I tell you, I have been amazed at the high quality of habitat that they have, and some of the things that are helping the whooping cranes to use the area are just things that they're doing for normal practices in agriculture, that they lease their lands and got an abundance of food. It's close by, so if the whooping cranes need to forage and get a little food, they can go to thousands of acres of grain crops that are usually right near the lakes. And so there's just a lot of things that are going on that can really help whooping cranes out. And some are going on and we don't even recognize that they are, like my amazement at what's going on the core lakes that is just not recognized because nobody's taken the time to write it up or anything else. I saw one nice picture that was taken on, I believe it was Wilson Lake, of whooping cranes, and there's a number of lakes that are like that have Harrison Lake is another good one. But anyway, they're all good. And here's my thinking on that. We don't have, Friends of the Wild Hoopers doesn't have a square foot of land. So we had to come up with something that we could do that would be productive for whooping cranes. And we thought, well, there's military lands, there's Indian reservations, there's Corps of Engineer lands, and that's a lot of land when you collectively put it together, and it's scattered from one end of the, from North Dakota to Texas. And the large bodies of water are going to become, in our opinion, much more valuable to whooping crane stopover areas if global warming is a fact. We know it's a fact. We just don't know how long it's lasting and what's going to, what it's causing. But the large bodies of water don't dry up. We flew over some lands in Oklahoma and Kansas about a year ago in a small plane with a person who'd been managing, looking at those lands for 25 years. And I thought, oh my God, we've got all kind of ponds down there. Maybe we're in the wrong business. And he said, no. He knew what we were doing. He says, 90% of those ponds will be dry by the 1st of October. First of all, the soil is porous and doesn't hold water. And 2, with the hot periods that we're having now, the ponds dry up. So we're going to have to really start concentrating on those large bodies of water because I think they might really pay off in the future. So that's my 2 cents worth. And we appreciate the Corps.
Thank you, Chester.
Yes, thanks, Chester. This is Jeremy. And you guys, again, if you would like to reach out to Chester, we didn't put his contact information up, which was a failure on my part, but their website is the Friends of Wild Whoopers. If you just Google him, you can get his contact info to get more information.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, well, without keeping us too much longer, I did want to quick try to get answers to two more questions in the chat features. We had one inquiring about the status of the translocation of the wild-reared whooping cranes from what's left of the Florida non-migratory population to Louisiana. Do either of you know about that?
Sure, this is Wade. I can speak to that. As I mentioned from a previous reintroduction project back in the 90s and early 2000s, we have about 14 remaining whooping cranes in central Florida, and we haven't reintroduced birds there in a number of years. But our plans are to translocate those birds to the Louisiana non-migratory reintroduction project. We're currently working on modifying our federal rule for those non-essential populations to be able to do that. So that is the plan, and we have partners. The state of Florida is on board with that, and we're just working through the process at this point to get that done. Hopefully over within the next year or so.
Thank you, Wade. Okay, and then one other question. Are there plans to do additional telemetry work with the Aransas wood buffalo population?
You want to take that one, Aaron?
Yeah, although you're part of it too. Yes, there are, actually we did some markings this summer, so kind of a second phase of the project. That's going to be a little bit more related, dialed into a few of specific issues, the oil sands mining specifically, and then some oil and gas exploration that's going on at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. And I think we're going to do another kind of a spin on the wind energy aspect of things. So there will be some more data coming in over the next, I don't know, 3-4 years.
Good, thank you. Another question: how many colts were banded at WBNP? I'm not sure of the acronym.
I actually don't have that right off the top of my head. 30-some, 32 maybe. Now that something like that, I think is what we banded over those years of the study.
Very good, thank you.
You bet.
Okay, well with that, go ahead. Is there somebody else? Okay, with that, Chester and Wade and Aaron, thank you all very, very much for sharing with us and for your work to help us accommodate the whooping cranes on our property. Jeremy or Rich, do y'all have any final thoughts?
Hey, Courtney, this is Jeremy. I don't have any additional thoughts other than thank you again, guys, Aaron and Wade, for doing this for us. And Courtney, thank you so much for all the logistics work and keeping us in check.
Yep, same here, Courtney. Thanks for, that was an excellent presentation. Appreciate everybody's involvement.
Yeah, thanks for giving us the opportunity to visit with you. And can't speak for Aaron, but I'm happy to engage in a webinar or a discussion with the Corps and DOD at any time. So great opportunity. Thank you.
Yep, this is Aaron. I agree. Yep, let us know if you have anything else.
All right. Thank you guys very much for a great presentation today and for sharing your expertise with us. Audience, thank you all for tuning in. I hope you all have a great afternoon, and that'll conclude our meeting.